We want to confess, please. We never imagined it would come to this. We never imagined that our greed, our jealousy, would bring so much suffering, not just to Ada, but to all of us. The curse we have brought upon the kingdom, it is unbearable. My king, please don't bury me, no, no. Let the earth take me, but mark my words, this land will never know peace again. The innocent will suffer as I have suffered. The heavens will curse this kingdom for what it has done. You will all pay for this injustice. 2 months had passed since the earth had swallowed Ada, and the kingdom felt a lingering coldness in the air. The palace, once filled with the hope of Ada's future, now seemed shrouded in a blanket of sorrow and unease. But the grief that had gripped the land was nothing compared to the unbearable loss of Mama Titi. In her small cottage, the world had crumbled. Without Ada, her light, her strength, and her reason to continue, Mama Titi withered. The villagers came to visit, but none could offer solace. She was a hollow shell, only a shadow of the woman she once was. For 2 months she had held on, living in the silence of her heartache, but her body could no longer bear the weight of the world. Late one night, the cold winds howled outside, but inside the cottage, there was an eerie stillness. Mama Titi sat by the window, her hands trembling as they clutched Ada's old shawl. Her thoughts wandered back to the day Ada had been taken, her daughter's face, her voice, her smile. The sorrow was too deep, the ache in her chest too strong. With one last whispered prayer, Mama Titi closed her eyes, her body succumbing to the grief that had consumed her. She died in the same cottage where Ada had been raised, the only place that still held memories of her daughter. The villagers found her the next morning, her lifeless body slumped against the wall, the shawl draped over her like a final embrace from Ada. She had gone to join her daughter, leaving the world behind. The curse Ada had spoken, the pain of her death, had taken both of them away. Mother and daughter, gone forever. Back at the royal palace, life had moved on in the cold, unfeeling way of the court. But things were far from peaceful. In the shadow of Ada's death, the palace maids, Amina, Bos, and Funmi, found themselves caught up in a new struggle, one that had nothing to do with serving the royal family and everything to do with who would win the prince's heart. Amina, Bos, and Funmi had always been rivals, but with Ada gone, their petty jealousy and desire for power grew into a full-blown competition. The prince, though still haunted by Ada's death, was still the crown's most prized possession, and the maids were not blind to the fact that the prince's heart was still ripe for the taking. Amma, the sly and calculating one, had already begun her attempts to get close to the prince, seeking every opportunity to linger in his presence, to offer him little comforts, and to remind him of Ada's absence. Her methods were subtle, a soft word here, a flirtatious glance there, but she knew exactly what she was doing. She was building a connection, laying the groundwork for what she hoped would be her future beside him. Bose, more outspoken than the others, did not wait for invitations. She flaunted her beauty, her charm, and her wit, believing these qualities would win the prince's favor. She often sought him out in the royal gardens, her laughter ringing in the air as she regaled him with stories of the palace. Bose was convinced that her boldness would capture the prince's attention. After all, she had always been the one who dared to take risks. Then there was Funmi, quiet and reserved, but no less determined. She had always watched from the sidelines, waiting for her moment to shine. The prince's sorrow over Ada's death had opened a new opportunity, and Funmi, with her calm demeanor and sweet words, had decided it was time to show the prince that she was more than just a maid. She would be his confidant, his comfort, and perhaps, in time, more. In the corridors of the palace, whispers began to spread. Amina, Bose, and Funmi were no longer just simple servants. They were contenders for the prince's heart. And while the prince remained lost in his grief, The maids were already plotting and scheming, each determined to emerge victorious. But none of them knew that their competition would not be without consequences. Ada's curse lingered in the air, and the choices they made would ripple through the palace, affecting not just their lives but the entire kingdom. The prince was not yet ready for a new love, but the maids, in their ambition, would soon learn that the consequences of playing with fate were far more severe than they could ever imagine. The cold, haunting grief of Ada's death had left its mark on the kingdom. The prince wandered through his days like a shadow of the man he once was, weighed down by the loss of Ada. But the maids of the palace, Amina, Bose, and Funmi, were not going to let his sorrow prevent them from pursuing what they all desired, the prince's heart. Each one had their own method, their own way of vying for his attention, and they knew the time had come to act. Amina, ever the cunning one, understood the power of subtlety. She knew that the prince, lost in his grief, would not respond to loud advances. Instead, she focused on quiet moments, seeking to catch his eye when he was least expecting it. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her charm that made her dangerous. One afternoon, the prince wandered into the royal garden, as he often did, to find solace in the quiet beauty of nature. It was then that Amina made her move. She appeared out of nowhere, her presence almost ethereal as she glided towards him. She had dressed in a flowing gown, the fabric delicate and sheer, allowing just enough of her skin to show to tempt his eyes. "Your Highness?" she said softly, her voice like a whisper in the wind. "I thought you might need some company." She stood just a few paces away, her eyes fixed on him, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. She moved closer, her body swaying gently with the breeze, making sure the prince could not miss the soft, graceful curves of her figure. Amina bent down slightly, picking a delicate flower from the ground and bringing it up to her face. "I brought this for you," she said with a smile, brushing her hair back, "to remind you that life still has beauty, even in the darkest times." Her words were tender, almost too soft, as she let the flower linger near his chest, her fingers grazing against him ever so briefly. She knew it was a small gesture, but it was enough to stir something deep within him, a reminder of the connection he once had with Ada. Bose, on the other hand, was not one to wait for subtlety. She believed in taking what she wanted, and the prince's grief would not stop her. When she caught wind of him walking through the palace courtyard, she knew it was her moment to make an impression. Dressed in a vibrant, form-fitting gown, Bose approached the prince with a confident stride, her eyes locked on his. Her presence was impossible to ignore, her beauty undeniable, but it was the way she carried herself that spoke louder than anything. "Your Highness," she greeted him, her voice playful and inviting. She smiled seductively, letting her eyes linger on his as she walked in front of him, her hips swaying with every step. She paused just a few paces ahead, letting the prince take in her beauty. Bose tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a mischievous smile. "It's a beautiful day, don't you think? Perhaps a walk through the gardens? I hear the flowers are in full bloom, and I thought it might cheer you up." Her words were light, teasing, and full of flirtation. She took another step closer, close enough for him to feel the warmth of her presence. Her gown clung to her body, showcasing her curves, and she made no effort to hide the fact that she was giving him a view of everything she had to offer. Bose knew exactly what she was doing. Every step, every glance was designed to make the prince see her in a way he had never seen before. She watched his reaction carefully, waiting to see if he would fall for her charm. Unlike Amina and Bose, Funmi was quieter, more reserved in her approach, but she understood the power of a calm, comforting presence. She had always been the type to observe from the shadows, but now, as the prince struggled with his grief, she saw her chance to step into the light. Funmi entered the royal library, where the prince often sought refuge, sitting among the towering shelves of books. She knew he came here to find solace in the written word, so she approached him with gentleness, her voice soft and soothing. "Your Highness," she greeted, her voice like a soft melody. She approached him slowly, her gaze warm and kind. She wore a simple, flowing gown that draped perfectly over her figure, the color soft and calming, making her look serene and approachable. "I thought you might enjoy a book on the arts of the kingdom," she said quietly, offering him a carefully chosen volume from the shelves. She had paid attention to his preferences, selecting a text she knew would appeal to his scholarly side. Funmi took a step closer to him, her hand brushing against his lightly as she handed him the book. Her touch was tender, almost as if she was offering comfort, and when she looked into his eyes, it was as though she saw into his very soul. "I know that these times are difficult, Your Highness, but we must remember that life goes on, and sometimes the smallest things can bring peace," she whispered, her eyes never leaving his. "If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Her presence was a quiet force, and though she didn't flaunt her beauty like the others, there was something undeniably calming about her. She wasn't pushing for his attention. Instead, she offered him an escape, a moment of peace in a chaotic world. As the days went on, Amina, Bose, and Funmi each continued to pursue the prince in their own ways, each trying to win his affection. But the prince, still caught in the web of his grief, remained distant, unsure of whether he was ready to open his heart to anyone again. The palace buzzed with whispers of the competition for the prince's heart, and though the maids were unaware of the consequences of their actions, one thing was certain: the kingdom would never be the same, and the prince's life, and the lives of the maids, would be forever changed by the choices they made. The days following the subtle advances of the maids were filled with tension in the royal palace. The prince, despite the heavy sorrow that clung to him, could not ignore the attention he was receiving from the three women. Their beauty and charm had begun to seep into his consciousness, and as much as he tried to keep his emotions buried, he found himself drawn to each of them in different ways. The prince spent his days pacing the halls of the palace, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Amina's sly, seductive ways made him feel wanted, her quiet whispers in the gardens stirring something in him he hadn't felt since Ada. Bose's boldness and confidence were impossible to ignore. She commanded attention, and every flirtatious move she made his heart race with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. And then there was Funmi. Her calm presence, her soothing words. She didn't pressure him, but her gentleness made him feel as though he could confide in her, as though she could heal the cracks in his heart. He had never been this confused before. Ada had been his light, the love of his life, and now she was gone. But the three maids, Amina, Bose, and Funmi, were offering him something different, something new. They each embodied a part of what he had lost and a part of what he longed for. And so the prince, in his grief-stricken state, made a decision. He would not choose one, not yet at least. He would allow each of them to court him in their own way, to show him who could be the most deserving of his heart. But deep down, the prince knew that this would not be without consequences. 3 women vying for his love would undoubtedly cause a rift, and he could feel the weight of his decisions pressing on him. While the prince was consumed by his emotional turmoil, the kingdom outside the palace walls was crumbling. The rains that had once nourished the land had failed, the usual rhythm of the seasons had been disrupted, and the dry seasons stretched on longer than anyone had ever known. The crops in the fields were withering under the unrelenting sun, and the rivers that once flowed freely had slowed to a mere trickle. Farmers who had once depended on the rains to feed their families now watched helplessly as their livelihoods withered. The dry soil cracked beneath their feet, leaving them with little hope. The golden fields that had once bloomed with maize, cassava, and yams were now barren stretches of dirt. The hunger that had been a distant worry for many now became an undeniable reality. In the villages, mothers wept as their children cried for food they could no longer find. The market square, once bustling with traders and customers, now sat empty, save for a few desperate souls attempting to sell what little they had left. Prices had soared, and even the wealthier citizens found themselves unable to buy enough to eat. The air was thick with the stench of poverty, and the once vibrant kingdom now seemed to be suffocating under the weight of its own suffering. The villagers had no choice but to work together, hoping that unity would bring them the strength they needed to survive. Elders gathered in the town square, discussing what could be done, but there were few answers. Everyone seemed to be at a loss. "Will the rains never come again?" an old man asked, his voice hoarse from years of wisdom and weariness. He looked around at the young faces gathered before him, his heart heavy. "We have planted and prayed, but the earth is dry. Our children grow weak from hunger. What will become of us?" A woman stood beside him, her face drawn and tired. "The prince, he has the power to change things. He is our hope. The land, the people, they need him now more than ever." The old man shook his head sadly. "The prince grieves. He is lost in his sorrow. How can he help us when he cannot even help himself?" In the meantime, the villagers could only pray for rain, for relief from the agony of hunger and loss. The crops continued to shrivel under the harsh sun, and the long months of drought seemed endless. The hunger grew worse, and there were whispers of people turning to desperate measures, of families losing hope and turning against each other. Back at the palace, the prince could feel the weight of his kingdom's suffering pressing on his conscience. He knew that his people were starving, that the land was dying, but his own heart was a battlefield. Each of the three women, the ones who now sought his affection, had become more than just contenders for his love. They represented different aspects of his inner turmoil. He longed for the warmth of Ada, but he could not deny the attraction he felt for Amina, Bose, and Funmi. Each of them brought something new to his life, but it was not just their beauty that drew him in. It was their ambition, their power, and their determination to claim what they believed was theirs. But as the days wore on, the prince could no longer ignore the cries of his people. He had a duty to his kingdom, to the land that had given him everything. The hunger and suffering that spread through the villages could not be ignored. The prince needed to act, but how could he when his heart was torn in so many directions? As the prince pondered his choices, a storm was beginning to form on the horizon, both in the kingdom and in his heart. The winds had started to pick up, and the air felt charged with tension. The earth was dry, but the people's hopes were still alive. They clung to the hope that the prince would rise above his grief, that he would remember who he was meant to be, and that he would lead them through this time of suffering. But the prince's decisions, his choice to court the three maids, his inability to choose, would not come without consequences. As the kingdom fought to survive the famine, as whispers of revolt began to swirl, the prince's distractions in the palace would soon become the least of his concerns. The suffering outside would soon come crashing through the palace gates, and no one would be able to escape the consequences of the prince's choices. The kingdom had already been teetering on the edge of disaster. With the crops withering in the fields, the villagers' hunger growing by the day, and the prince torn between his grief and his desires, no one could have foreseen the event that would send the entire royal family and the kingdom into chaos. It all began on an ordinary day, when the royal palace woke up to a strange and unsettling silence. The guards on duty had been changed the night before, and everything seemed normal, yet something felt off. The usual bustle of the palace, the servants' chatter, and the distant hum of life in the courtyards had vanished. But it was not until the king went to his chamber that the reality of what had happened struck. The king, always a man of tradition and pride, rose early that morning as he did every day. He walked to his royal chamber, where his most prized possession, the crown of the kingdom, was kept safely under lock and key. It was the symbol of his authority, of his birthright, and it had never once been disturbed. But when he opened the vault, his heart nearly stopped. The crown was gone. The intricate golden band that had been passed down through generations, encrusted with precious jewels and gemstones, was nowhere to be found. The place where it had once rested was empty, cold, and dark. The king's breath caught in his throat as his mind raced. "Where is it?" the king shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and growing panic. He called for his closest guards, and within moments, the room was filled with soldiers, all searching desperately for any sign of the crown. The king paced back and forth, his mind reeling. How could this happen? Who could have taken it? His eyes flickered to the guards, but they were equally confused and concerned. There was no sign of a break-in, no indication that anyone had entered the royal chamber without permission. The crown, it seemed, had simply vanished into thin air. In the weeks since Ada's death, the kingdom had already been on edge. The people were hungry, the rains had not come, and rumors of unrest were beginning to spread. Now, with the crown gone, the very symbol of the king's power had been stripped away. As the king's panic grew, he couldn't help but think back to the curse Ada had spoken just before her death. The words she had uttered still rang in his ears. "The land will suffer, and all who have wronged me will feel the consequences. No crown will rest upon your head, and your kingdom will be consumed by darkness." The king had dismissed the words as the ramblings of a desperate woman, consumed by grief and anger. But now, as he stood in the empty room, the crown's disappearance felt too coincidental. Ada's curse seemed to be alive, lingering over the kingdom, its effects reaching deeper than anyone had imagined. Back in the prince's chambers, the news of the crown's disappearance spread quickly. The prince, already consumed by his own personal turmoil, now found himself thrust into a new crisis. The throne was now in jeopardy, and the stability of the kingdom was threatened more than ever. The prince had been torn between his grief and the maid's manipulations, but now the reality of his father's loss weighed heavily on him. He could feel the pressure building around him. His thoughts returned to Ada and the curse she had left behind. Could this be the result of her death? Was this punishment for the kingdom's neglect of her? But more than that, the prince felt the weight of the crown's disappearance on his own shoulders. As the heir to the throne, it was his responsibility to restore order. Yet, with the kingdom's crisis mounting, hunger, drought, unrest, and now this new mystery, he didn't know where to start. He thought of the 3 maids who had been vying for his affection, but none of them seemed capable of helping him navigate the chaos that had now gripped the kingdom. They were just distractions, temporary solace in a time of profound grief. As the prince's confusion and the king's panic spread throughout the palace, word of the missing crown soon reached the ears of the common folk. Whispers of the crown's disappearance began circulating in the villages, fanning the flames of unrest. The villagers, already struggling with hunger and fear of an uncertain future, began to believe that the disappearance of the crown was a sign of something far more sinister. Rumors began to spread that the king had lost his power, that the royal family had been cursed, and that the kingdom itself was falling apart. People spoke of rebellion, of the possibility that a new ruler would rise, one who would restore balance to the land. The kingdom was on the brink of collapse, and the royal family was powerless to stop it. Hunger was spreading like wildfire, and now, with the crown gone, there was no clear path forward. The prince, still grieving over Ada, knew that the time to act was now. He had to find the crown, and quickly, before the kingdom descended into chaos. But where was it? Who had taken it, and why? Outside the palace, the wind began to pick up, and the once quiet land seemed to stir with a strange energy. The air was thick with tension, as though something was about to happen. The skies darkened, and the first signs of a storm began to gather on the horizon. Was the curse of Ada truly at work? Was this just the beginning of something far worse? As the kingdom stood on the brink of collapse, the prince realized that this was no longer just about grief, or the maids, or the power struggles within the palace. Something far greater was at play. The disappearance of the crown was a sign, a harbinger of the dark forces that were now rising. The kingdom had long been haunted by Ada's curse, but now it was reaching out to touch the lives of those who had once been mere players in the backdrop. of Ada's tragedy. The three palace maids, Amina, Bose, and Funmi, had each tasted the bitter fruit of their rivalry, their ambition to win the prince's heart, and now they were paying the price for it. The days of seduction and rivalry were over. Their desperate attempts to lure the prince into their embrace, to play the game of power in the palace, had invited a far darker force into their lives. The curse Ada had spoken of, the one that haunted the land with death and despair, was not done yet. It started with Amina. She had been the most subtle, the most calculating of the three maids. Amina, who had danced around the prince with soft words and coy glances, had believed that her beauty and charm would win him over. But the moment she felt the sting of jealousy, when the prince's eyes turned away from her and toward Bose, the curse found its mark. It began with a slight ache in her legs. At first, Amina dismissed it as nothing more than fatigue from her constant scheming, the late nights spent trying to get closer to the prince. But soon it grew worse. Her legs, once slender and graceful, began to swell. The swelling spread, slowly at first, just enough to make her uncomfortable. But by the second day, the pain was unbearable. Her legs had become swollen, so swollen that she could barely walk. But the worst was yet to come. As days passed, the skin on her legs began to change color. It turned a sickly shade of purple, then brown, as if the blood within her veins had been poisoned. The swelling did not subside, instead it worsened. The skin around her ankles and calves began to crack open, and a foul odor filled the air. It was the smell of decay, of rot. The maids whispered behind Amina's back, speculating on what could be causing such a dreadful affliction. Amina, once the most graceful and proud of the maids, now hobbled through the palace like a shadow of her former self. Her legs now grotesque and swollen beyond recognition. She could no longer attend to her duties, no longer move with the confidence she once had. She had become a prisoner to the curse that now claimed her body. Next came Bose. Once the boldest and most outspoken of the maids, Bose had believed her beauty and daring would win the prince's heart. She flaunted herself before him, her laughter filling the air, her body an open invitation to him. But when the prince, torn between his grief and the advances of the maids, began to pull away from her, she too found herself caught in the grip of the curse. At first, Bose thought nothing of the strange feeling in her stomach. It started as a dull ache like hunger, but it grew steadily worse. Within a few days, her belly began to swell. At first, she thought it was the result of overeating, but as the days passed, the swelling continued. Her once flat stomach began to protrude like a pregnant woman's belly, but it was not the natural curve of pregnancy. It was unnatural, grotesque in its swelling, and no matter what she did, it continued to grow. The swelling was not confined to her abdomen alone. It seemed to spread across her entire body, and with each passing day, Bose's once beautiful figure became more distorted. She felt a strange heaviness inside, as though something was growing within her, pressing against her organs. No matter how much she drank, how much she tried to eat, nothing could stop the expanding belly that seemed to be a living, breathing entity all on its own. Soon she could no longer wear her clothes, and the other maids whispered about her strange condition. Bose, once the embodiment of confidence and charm, now found herself hiding in the shadows, ashamed of what was happening to her. Every day her belly grew, and every day she felt more and more disconnected from the world she had once known. It was as though the curse Ada had left behind was consuming her from the inside out. Then there was Funmi, the quiet one. Funmi had always been the most reserved of the three, biding her time and waiting for her chance. She had stayed in the background, watching as Amina and Bose fought for the prince's affection, but deep inside, she longed for the same love, the same power. But the prince had never looked at her the way he had looked at the others, and now she was about to face a horror unlike any other. It began subtly, an odd discharge, something that Funmi tried to ignore, but soon it became impossible to dismiss. At first, it was just a slight wetness between her legs, an unusual sensation, but by the third day, Funmi's condition worsened. Her private parts began to drip constantly, and no matter how much she tried to clean herself, the mucus kept coming, thick, foul-smelling. It oozed from her like a dark, slimy stream, leaving her feeling sick and disgusted. As the days passed, Funmi's condition only became worse. The mucus became darker, almost black, and the stench was unbearable. She was unable to hide it from the other maids, and they quickly began to avoid her. The once quiet Funmi, who had hoped to win the prince's favor through her sweet demeanor, was now an outcast, marked by the curse that ravaged her body in the most humiliating way possible. She was no longer able to serve the prince or perform her duties as a maid. Her once beautiful figure had been replaced by a body that was diseased and putrid. No matter how much she begged for help, no one seemed able to offer her any relief. Her condition worsened by the day, and the pain of her humiliation was more than she could bear. The three maids, once proud, once beautiful, were now living testaments to the price of ambition and the consequences of their rivalry. Their actions had brought them to this point, and the curse Ada had left behind was now consuming them one by one. Each of them had once hoped to win the prince's heart, but now they were paying the price for their selfishness, their deceit, and their vanity. The prince, still reeling from the grief of Ada's death and the weight of the curse upon him, could only watch in horror as the women he had once been drawn to became shadows of their former selves. The kingdom, once full of life and love, was now a place of sickness, sorrow, and decay. The curse had claimed not only Ada's mother, but also the very hearts of those who had sought to replace her. As the days passed, the once beautiful palace, with its golden halls and lush gardens, seemed to wither. The prince could only wonder what fate awaited him next. Would he too be consumed by the curse that had taken so many lives? Or was there still a way to stop the suffering and restore peace to the kingdom? The kingdom, shrouded in misery, had reached its breaking point. The suffering of the people was only deepening, and the curse that loomed over the land had not relented. The prince, desperate to save his people and the royal family from further despair, knew there was no choice but to seek the help of the ancient and mysterious herbalist, the one believed to have the power to commune with the gods. For weeks, the prince had heard whispers of the herbalist's powers. He was a figure shrouded in myth, known for his ability to call upon the gods for guidance and intervention. Many believed that he could heal the land's wounds, remove the curse, and restore peace to the kingdom. But such power did not come easily. The prince knew that calling upon the herbalist would be no small task, and the price for such aid was often steep. But there was no time to waste. The people were starving, the crops had withered, and the once lush fields were barren. The kingdom was on the brink of collapse, and the prince could feel the weight of every life pressing down on him. The prince, along with a small entourage, made his way to the herbalist's humble abode, a secluded hut hidden deep within the forest. The path leading there was long and treacherous, winding through thick trees and fog-covered hills. As they reached the herbalist's dwelling, the air seemed to grow heavier, thick with an energy that felt both ancient and foreboding. The herbalist's home was simple, a small, weathered hut surrounded by herbs and plants of every kind. The smell of strange flowers and burning incense filled the air. As the prince approached, the door creaked open, and an old man with long white hair and a weathered face appeared. His eyes were piercing, filled with a wisdom that seemed to see straight through the prince's soul. The prince bowed respectfully, though he could feel his own unease. "Great herbalist," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his kingdom's suffering, "I seek your help. My people are dying, the land is withering, and a curse has fallen upon us. I am desperate for your guidance." The herbalist studied the prince for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. He then spoke in a voice as deep and rumbling as thunder. "You seek the gods' aid, but do you understand the price of such help, prince?" The prince nodded, though fear lingered in his heart. "I am willing to do whatever it takes to save my people." The herbalist's expression remained unchanged. The gods do not give their favor lightly. Their power is not free, and their demands are not simple. The prince took a deep breath. What must be done? I will pay any price, no matter what it takes. The herbalist stepped forward, motioning for the prince to follow him into the depths of his hut. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, and the walls were covered in ancient scrolls and artifacts. The gods are watching, the herbalist said gravely, settling into a chair made of woven branches. They will only intervene if certain conditions are met. The curse that has befallen your kingdom is no random act. It is the result of deeds that have gone unpunished, sins that have been committed in the dark. It is only through confession and atonement that the gods will lift their curse. The prince frowned, his brow furrowing with confusion. Confession? But who has committed these sins? My people are innocent. It is only the ones who have wronged us who should suffer. The herbalist shook his head slowly. The gods see beyond the surface. They see the hearts of all who have played a role in this curse. It is not just the obvious wrongdoers, but those who allowed this darkness to spread. The prince was silent, unsure of how to proceed. Then what must I do? The herbalist's eyes glinted with the wisdom of ages. You must wait. The gods will not act until those who have wronged the land confess their sins. Only when they come forward with true repentance in their hearts will the curse begin to lift. Without confession, no power in this world or the next can save your kingdom. The prince felt a cold chill wash over him. The fate of his kingdom, his people, and the royal family now rested in the hands of those who had wronged the gods. The maids, Amenia, Bose, and Funny, had played their part in this tragedy. Their greed, their ambition, their manipulation of the prince's heart had set everything in motion. But they had not confessed, and the gods had made it clear that only through their admission of guilt would the curse be lifted. The prince knew that the task now lay with the maids, but he could not force them to confess. They were proud, each of them consumed by their own desires. They had been given power, and to admit their wrongs would mean losing everything. The question lingered in his mind. Would they ever confess? Or would their stubbornness bring even more suffering to the kingdom? Do you have any advice for me, great herbalist? The prince asked, his voice strained with the burden of his responsibility. The herbalist looked at him, his face a mask of solemnity. You must give them time. But know this, prince. The gods are not patient. Their demands will not wait forever. If they do not confess soon, the land will continue to wither. The curse will become stronger, and there may be no way to stop it. The prince left the herbalist's hut with a heavy heart, his mind swirling with the weight of what he had learned. The gods' wrath could only be quelled by the maid's confession, but time was running out. The crops had already dried, the people were starving, and the kingdom was crumbling before his eyes. He returned to the palace, where Amina, Bose, and Funmi still suffered from the curse. Their bodies were twisted and ravaged by the curse they had brought upon themselves. The prince's eyes lingered on them, his heart filled with both pity and anger. How much longer could he wait for them to confess? As days turned into weeks, the prince grew more desperate. The maid's pain was unbearable to witness, yet none of them had the courage to admit their wrongs. The prince was trapped in a cruel cycle. His kingdom was dying, his people were suffering, and he had no control over the outcome. The prince's only hope now rested in the hands of those who had wronged the gods. And as time ticked by, the pressure to confess only grew stronger. The curse that had ravaged the palace, the kingdom, and its people now reached its most brutal point. Amina, Bose, and Funmi, once the beautiful and ambitious maids, were now little more than twisted shadows of their former selves. The consequences of their actions had been dire, and the gods' wrath had not relented. Amina's legs had swollen to an unnatural size, the skin turning an angry red as the flesh seemed to rot from within. The pain was unbearable, and she could no longer stand without help. Her once graceful walk had turned into a limp, her beauty marred by the cruel effects of the curse. She had tried everything, medicines, rituals, prayers, but nothing worked. The curse only deepened. Bose's suffering was equally horrendous. Her belly had swelled unnaturally, much like a pregnant woman's, but no child was growing inside. Instead, her stomach continued to swell daily, as if something inside her was fighting to escape. Her breath was short, her body weak, and her movements slow. She could barely stand, let alone walk, and the swelling in her abdomen had reached the point where she could hardly move. Then there was Funmi. Her condition was the most grotesque. Mucus, thick and foul, leaked from her private parts, staining her clothing and making it impossible for her to maintain any dignity. The smell was overpowering, a constant reminder of the curse that had been placed upon her. She could not even sit without feeling as though her body was betraying her. The three of them had lived with their suffering for days. No relief, no hope. The kingdom had become a place of dread, and the air was thick with the tension of impending doom. But in their misery, something shifted. They knew what needed to be done. The gods had made it clear that only through confession could the curse be lifted, but the truth had been buried deep within them. In the dead of night, as the palace lay still and silent, the three maids gathered in the darkest corner of the royal gardens. Their bodies twisted in agony, but their minds were clearer than they had ever been. Each one knew that there was only one way out of the nightmare they had created. Amina was the first to speak, her voice trembling with both fear and desperation. "It was us," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward Bose and Funmi. "We planted the gold jewelry in the queen's chamber. We made sure she would be blamed because we knew Ada would take the prince's heart, and we could not allow that to happen." Bose, her swollen belly causing her to gasp for breath, nodded in agreement. "We thought if Ada were gone, the prince would have no choice but to choose one of us. We were tired of being overlooked, tired of being just servants. We wanted more. We wanted him." Funmi's eyes, sunken and hollow, were filled with tears as she added, "We never imagined it would come to this. We never imagined that our greed, our jealousy would bring so much suffering, not just to Ada, but to all of us. The curse we have brought upon the kingdom, it is unbearable." Each of the maids fell silent as the weight of their confession hung in the air. The gods had already heard their admission, and the price of their betrayal was now upon them. Amina, Bose, and Funmi knew that their fate had already been sealed the moment they spoke the truth. The gods demanded their blood, their lives, as payment for the suffering they had caused. The confession had not lifted the curse. It had only set in motion the final, inevitable consequence. Amina's legs, already swollen and rotting, began to pulse with a grotesque force. Her cries of agony filled the night as her legs swelled even further, the skin breaking open and spilling a thick black substance. Her body writhed, but it was no use. The gods had claimed her. With one final, guttural scream, Amina fell to the ground, her body convulsing violently before it collapsed into lifelessness. The curse had claimed her at last. Bose's stomach, once swollen beyond belief, now bulged in ways that seemed unnatural, as if something inside was trying to escape. Her breaths came in short gasps, her eyes wide with panic. She could feel her body tearing apart from the inside. The pain was unbearable, and, as she clutched her belly, she let out a final cry. Her body ruptured, and the swelling exploded in a violent burst. The gods had claimed her, too, her life snuffed out in an instant. Funmi's body, too, began to betray her. The mucus that had flowed from her private parts now turned to a thick, dark liquid, and she could no longer move. She could feel the life draining from her as the foul substance covered her skin. She fell to the ground, her body twitching uncontrollably. She managed a single, desperate gasp before her eyes rolled back and her body went limp. The gods had claimed her as well, her life taken by the very curse she had helped bring upon the kingdom. The kingdom was still in the grip of its suffering, but with the death of Amina, Bose, and Funmi, a strange calm seemed to descend upon the palace. The curse, however, had not been lifted. The people continued to starve. The crops remained barren, and the suffering was far from over. But now, with the maids gone, the kingdom's fate rested in the hands of those who had not fallen victim to their selfishness. The prince, still reeling from the deaths of the women who had once competed for his heart, now had to find a way to save his people from the curse that still loomed over them. And so, as the sun rose on the kingdom, the prince knew that the real work had just begun. The confession had been made, but the true test was yet to come. The gods had taken their toll, but whether or not the kingdom could be saved was still unknown. The kingdom, which had been plagued by a relentless curse, had endured unspeakable suffering. The crops had withered, the people had starved, and darkness had overshadowed the land. But now, in the wake of Amina, Bo's, and Funmi's deaths, something was changing. The winds shifted, and for the first time in many months, the air felt still but full of anticipation. The long-dreaded storm that had been whispered about for so long had finally come. It started with a drop. A single raindrop fell from the sky, hitting the dusty ground in the royal gardens. The land, parched and cracked, seemed to drink it in greedily. Slowly, more raindrops began to fall, first in a drizzle, then in torrents. The heavens opened wide, unleashing a powerful rain that bathed the kingdom in its healing waters. The people who had lived in fear and despair poured into the streets, their faces turned up to the sky, wide-eyed and filled with awe. The rain was like a cleansing flood, washing away not just the dust from the earth, but the suffering and sorrow that had hung over the kingdom for so long. In the royal palace, the prince stood by the window, watching as the rain fell in a steady, refreshing stream. The curse had not been easily broken, but with the deaths of those who had plotted against Ada, the gods seemed to have granted mercy. His heart, heavy with grief, felt lighter now, as though the weight of the curse had been lifted from his shoulders. The prince thought of Ada, of her kindness, her beauty, and her love for the kingdom. He knew she had not deserved the fate that had befallen her, but in her death, she had set the stage for the healing of the land. Her curse, while tragic, had opened the door for truth to come to light, and now, peace was beginning to return. As the days passed, the rain continued to fall, reviving the land. The crops that had once dried and withered began to sprout anew, their green shoots breaking through the soil like a promise of better days ahead. The rivers, which had been low and stagnant, now swelled with fresh water, their flow strong and clear. The people returned to their farms, their homes, and their work with renewed hope in their hearts. The kingdom, which had been torn apart by greed, envy, and betrayal, was beginning to rebuild. The people no longer lived in fear of the curse. They had witnessed the power of truth and the justice that had been served. Though the memories of those lost would never be forgotten, the land had been given a second chance. The prince, having witnessed the horrors of ambition, now understood that peace could only come from humility, honesty, and love for the people. He vowed to rule justly, remembering the lessons Ada had taught him, even in death. He would not repeat the mistakes of the past. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, the kingdom seemed to glow with a renewed vibrancy. The people celebrated, not just because the rain had come, but because they had been given a chance to start anew. The fear and suffering of the past had been washed away, and now the promise of peace filled the air. The kingdom was healed, and the prince stood tall, ready to lead his people into a new era. The land was no longer cursed, and peace had been restored. Ada's spirit, though lost, had played her part in bringing about the change that was so desperately needed. As the last of the rain fell, the prince turned his eyes to the horizon. The journey of suffering, betrayal, and death had ended, but it had paved the way for something better. And so the kingdom moved forward, free from the grip of the curse, filled with hope, and ready to embrace the future. You know, the kingdom wasn't always like this, full of sorrow, pain, and distrust. It was once full of life, hope, and promise, especially with Ada. Ada wasn't just a maid, She was the one who brought light to the place, and she caught the prince's eye in a way no one expected. But as fate would have it, some people couldn't stand seeing Ada rise. They went behind her back, framed her for stealing the queen's gold jewelry, and ruined her life. It was a sad ending, but, as you might guess, it wasn't the end of the story. After Ada's death, the kingdom didn't just lose a girl, they lost their peace. And you know, when one person suffers, it can affect everyone. Ada's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, but a curse on the entire land. Mama Titi, Ada's mother, could barely live without her daughter. She was left to wither away in sorrow, and soon she joined Ada in death. The kingdom, already mourning, was about to learn that the consequences of their actions didn't stop there. Back at the royal palace, life moved on, but it wasn't peaceful. 3 maids, Amina, Bose, and Funmi, were fighting for the prince's attention. They didn't care about serving the royal family anymore, they only cared about winning the prince's heart. Each one had her own method. Amina was sly, Bose was bold, and Funmi was reserved but had her own quiet way of getting close to him. They all thought they could use their charms to win him over. But the thing is, they didn't realize how much power they were playing with. You see, when you mess with fate and try to manipulate people for your own gain, things tend to go wrong. Soon enough, the kingdom started to feel the impact of their actions. Crops were dying, the land became barren, and hunger spread through the villages. People were suffering. The gods were clearly angry, and yet the maids didn't stop. They were so consumed by their jealousy and ambition that they didn't notice how badly they were destroying everything around them. But that's the thing about lies and deceit. It always catches up with you. Amina, Bose, and Funmi, who once thought they could have the prince for themselves, started facing some pretty horrifying consequences. Amina's legs started swelling up and they began rotting. Bose's belly grew larger and larger, like she was pregnant, but it wouldn't stop swelling. Funmi, well, she started having this disgusting mucus coming from her private parts, a sign that everything she had done was coming back to her. They couldn't ignore it anymore. They panicked, of course, and decided to call on the eyes of the gods, the most powerful spiritual figure in the land. He told them he couldn't help them until they confessed the truth. The maids, frightened but unwilling to admit their wrongdoings just yet, didn't confess. But trust me, things were only going to get worse from there. As the sicknesses grew worse, they finally gave in. They confessed one by one that they had framed Ada for stealing the queen's jewelry, all because they were jealous and wanted to win the prince's heart. They admitted to lying, to betrayal, to hurting an innocent person just for their own selfish desires. But it was too late. The consequences of their actions were already sealed. One by one, they died in agony. Amina, Bose, and Funmi, all taken by the curse that they had helped create. And you know what happened next? The rain finally came. The land that had been dry and barren for so long suddenly flourished again. The crops started to grow, the kingdom began to heal, and peace returned. It's like the land knew when the right people paid the price for the wrong they'd done. Ada's curse was lifted, and the kingdom could breathe again. But what did we learn from all this? First, never try to get ahead by tearing someone else down. The maids thought they could win by lying and hurting Ada, but in the end they were the ones who paid the price. The prince was so lost in his grief over Ada's death that he didn't even realize the damage his maids were causing. It's easy to think that getting what you want through lies is the easy way, but trust me, it always leads to disaster. Second, sometimes the truth comes out no matter how long it takes. Ada's truth came out too late for her, but eventually, the ones who betrayed her had to face it. Lies might seem like they're working for a while, but they never last. In the end, truth always wins. So if you've been hiding something, remember, it always catches up with you. And lastly, peace and healing come when we take responsibility for our actions. The kingdom could only heal when the truth came out, when people took responsibility for the wrongs they'd done, and when they paid the price for it. The rain that came symbolized a fresh start, but only after the storm had passed. So, what did we learn from the whole story? Don't let envy or greed guide your actions. Always stay true to your values, be honest, and never forget that everything you do has a consequence. The kingdom might have been saved, but not without pain and loss. And that's the tale of Ada, the prince, the maids, and the kingdom. A reminder that what goes around truly comes around. Peace only comes when people own up to their mistakes, and the truth always finds its way to the surface.